The slave economy. So it says the South relied on slavery heavily for economic prosperity, so for good money, and used wealth as a way to justify enslavement practices. So the overview reads, with the invention, of the cotton gin, cotton became the cash crop of the Deep South, stimulating increased demand for enslaved people from the Upper South to toil the land. Stimulating means to create need for or create want for, and toil means to work. As the disparity between plantation owners and poor white people widened in the Deep South, deeply entrenched racism blurred perceived class divides. So deeply entrenched means like deeply inside, deeply a part of. The slave economy of the South had international economic reach since the majority of cotton was sold abroad, and connecting the United States to the international marketplace. Cotton is king. By the mid-19th century, southern commercial centers like New Orleans had become home to its greatest concentration of wealth in the United States. Slavery shaped the culture and the society of the South, which rested on a racial ideology of white supremacy. And more importantly, many whites believed slavery itself sustained the newly prosperous Southern economy. So in New Orleans, they had the most wealth, and they were based on racial ideology of white supremacy. However, cotton was a labor-intensive crop, and many plantation owners were reducing the number of people they enslaved due to high cost and low output. In 1793, Eli Whitney revolutionized, which means to make a great change, cotton production when he invented the cotton gin, a device that separated the seeds from raw cotton. Suddenly, a process that was extraordinarily labor-intensive could be completed quickly and easily. By the early 1800s, cotton emerged as the South's major cash crop, a good produced for commercial value instead of for use by the owner, so a crop made just to get money. Cotton quickly eclipsed tobacco, rice, and sugar in economic importance. To eclipse means to kind of like take over. Cotton became so much more important than the cash crops when America was becoming a country. So this picture says printed depicting enslaved people using the cotton gin. So the cotton gin looked like. American plantation owners began to turn to the world market to sell their newfound surplus, so their newfound big amount of cotton. Cotton had the advantage of being easily stored and transported. A demand for it already existed in industrial textile mills in Great Britain, at a time a steady stream of slave-grown American cotton would also supply northern textile mills. Southern cotton, picked and processed by newly profitable slaves, helped fuel the 19th century Industrial Revolution in both the United States and Great Britain. This lucrative international trade brought new wealth and new residents to New Orleans as products and people traveled down the new water highway of the United States, the Mississippi River. The invention of the steamship dramatically increased the use of the river as a quick and easy way of transporting goods. By 1840, New Orleans alone had 12% of the nation's total banking capital. Enslaved people, cotton, and the steamship transformed the city from a relatively isolated corner of North America to a thriving metropolis that rivaled New York in importance. By 1850, of the 3.2 million enslaved people in the country's 15 slave states, 1.8 million were producing cotton. By 1860, slave labor was producing over 2 billion pounds of cotton per year. Indeed, American cotton soon made up 2/3 of the global supply, and production continued to soar. By the time of the Civil War, South Carolina politician James Henry Hammond confidently proclaimed that the North could never threaten the South because cotton is king. The production of cotton brought the South more firmly into the larger American and Atlantic markets. About 75% of the cotton produced in the United States was eventually exported abroad. Exporting in such high volumes made the United States the undisputed world leader in cotton production. Although the larger American and Atlantic markets relied on Southern cotton in this era, the South also depended on these markets for obtaining food, manufactured goods, and loans. Thus, the American Revolution transformed the South just as it had other regions. Sold down the river, the domestic slave trade. With the cotton boom in the Deep South came a spike in demand for enslaved laborers to work the fields. Although Congress abolished the foreign slave trade in 1808, Americans continued to smuggle Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. However, the domestic slave trade primarily supplied the necessary labor force. As the tobacco crop dwindled, former tobacco farmers in the older states of Virginia and Maryland found themselves with a surplus of enslaved laborers whom they were obligated to feed, clothe, and shelter. Some slaveholders responded to the situation by freeing enslaved laborers. Far more decided to sell them. The domestic slave trade offered many economic opportunities for white men. Between 1790 and 1859, slaveholders in Virginia sold more than 500,000 enslaved laborers. The phrase "to be sold down the river," used by Harriet Beecher Stowe in her 1852 novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, refers to this forced migration from the upper southern states to the deep South, lower on the Mississippi, to grow cotton. Since the conditions of slavery, as well as chances of escape, got progressively worse further south, slaveholders in the upper South wielded the notion of being sold down the river as a threat to keep their slaves in line. All told, the movement of slaves from the upper South to the deep South made up one of the largest forced internal migrations in the United States. This picture is a print depicting a slave auction in the upper South. Economic inequality and the democracy. The South prospered, but its wealth was very unequally distributed. Upward social mobility did not exist for the millions of enslaved people who produced a substantial portion of the nation's wealth, while poor Southern whites envisioned a day when they might rise enough in the world to own enslaved laborers of their own. Because of the cotton boom, there were more millionaires per capita in the Mississippi River Valley by 1860 than anywhere else in the United States. However, in that same year, only 3% of the white people owned more than 50 enslaved people, and 2/3 of white households in the South did not own any slaves at all. Distribution of wealth became more and more concentrated at the top. Fewer white people owned enslaved laborers in 1860 than in 1840. Despite this unequal distribution of wealth, non-slaveholding white people, many of them called yeoman farmers, shared with white planters a common set of values, most notably a belief in white supremacy. Whites, whether rich or poor, were bound together by racism. The institution of race-based slavery diffused class tensions among whites because no matter how poor they were, white Southerners had race in common with the mighty plantation owners. Significantly, all white Southerners were bound together by the constant prevailing fear of slave uprisings. A painting depicting a cotton plantation in Mississippi. What do you think? Do you think the slave economy increased sectional tension in the antebellum period? How so? So sectional means like different sections, different pieces. Antebellum is a word meaning the South pre-Civil War, the antebellum period. How did the Industrial Revolution affect the slavery economy and vice versa? How would you describe the relationship between the two? Why did economically disadvantaged white people not see a common cause with enslaved people?